So I just wanted to start with Governor Pritzker. Obviously, his #1 priority right now is his graduated income tax plan, which he unveiled the rates last month. And it's basically raising the rates for the wealthiest 3% of the state residents, and giving a small break to those who make under $250,000. This is a huge priority. We see it kind of playing out in the budget process right now. A question to everyone, if we could start with Ralph. First, your thoughts on why the graduated or fair tax plan would be good for the state. And as we all know, it's not an immediate situation, so what can the state do in the interim?
Right, so if you pick up a book on tax policy, which I'm sure everyone in this room is just dying to do, but if you pick up a book on tax policy, you'll see that there are a couple of economic principles you're supposed to build into your tax system, and different taxes perform different roles. And believe it or not, one of the economic principles is fairness, and a second is responsiveness. The only tax that actually can be designed to be fair, that is account for ability to pay and to respond to the economy, is the income tax, because you could create different rates for different levels of income. Why that responds to the economy is very clear if you look at the recent data. So from 1979 all the way through 2015, the last year I have household income data through, the wealthiest 1% in America saw their incomes increase by about 175% after inflation. In Illinois, it was higher, 177%. That's the wealthiest 1%. The bottom 99% in Illinois, on average, saw their incomes increase by only 9%. If you looked at just the bottom 90% of households, their incomes decreased after inflation. So if you're going to have a tax that could recognize this reality and respond to it, it has to be the income tax, because it is the only tax that could have a variable rate, lower rates at lower levels of income and higher rates at higher levels of income. It is literally the only way to build vertical fairness into a tax structure with a rate. You could do some other things with tax policy, like an earned income tax credit and those kinds of things, targeted relief. But it's the only way to use a rate to create fairness. Every other tax imposed by state or local government is regressive in its impact. It'll take a larger bite out of a lower middle income family's pocket than it will a more affluent family. So the Pritzker administration got it right from just a tax policy standpoint. If they wanted to have a fair and responsive tax, you need a graduated rate structure for your income tax. Illinois Constitution requires a flat rate, so you got to change that. The rate structure he proposed is rational. It's within our neighboring states. You look at Iowa's top rate, by the way, in their income tax is 8.9%, which kicks in at $71,000 of income. You know, JB's top rate of 7.95 kicks in at $1 million. So you can see it's within the realm of other states that have a graduated rate structure. It certainly is a rational structure. Do we need the revenue that it generates? You know, absolutely. The $3.4 billion he's projecting it would bring in would go a part of the way to addressing the state's fiscal problems, and I guess I should talk about those real quickly. We have an accumulated deficit projected at the end of this year, fiscal year 2019, which is ending in a couple of months, of about $8.13 billion. Of that deficit, it sits in only about $26 billion of expenditures on services. If you want to know what those services are, 95% of those expenditures, or over 9 out of $10, go to 4 things: education, healthcare, social services, and public safety. So literally over 30% of what we spend on education, health, social services, and public safety in Illinois is currently deficit spending. So generating some new revenue and generating it in a relatively fair fashion and imposing that tax burden on people who are seeing incredibly rapid growth in income over time is a very rational and good tax policy thing to do. Does it solve all our problems, Tina? No. There's other things we're going to have to do, and I'm sure we'll talk about those.
Okay. Laurence?
Yeah, I think most Illinoisans sort of had a sigh of relief about 2 months ago when Governor Pritzker delivered his 2020 budget proposal. He basically announced his plans for how to spend $39 billion. The governor called it a bridge budget because he wants to bridge from now until the time that he is able to get a graduated income tax, as Ralph has mentioned, enacted and get that additional revenue. Approximately $3.4 billion is the hoped return on the graduated income tax proposal. The challenge is that doesn't show up till sometime late in 2021, right? The first time that any of you will be able to vote on the graduated income tax is in 2020. So that gives those of us who watch the state's unpaid bills continue to rise, our credit rating teetering right at junk, and just a lot of things that the state of Illinois needs to be doing. It gives us pause as to what happens if parts of that bridge don't get built. The governor is proposing marijuana full legalization, and significant revenues are built into the budget. This is an idea that has some, I think, some social benefits. The decriminalization has a lot of merit, but sticking just to the financial side, it's an uncertainty whether the revenues will be there for marijuana. It's an uncertainty whether the revenues from now legalization of sports gambling and how the state will handle sports gambling and marijuana. So there's some big question marks. One area that the Civic Federation watches, because we know that it drives the state's financial condition and our local governments, is pensions and pension funding. The governor is proposing to push the pension funding schedule out another 7 years instead of staying on the 50-year derided schedule that most of the proponents for pension funding identify as the blame for the governor 3 governors ago that created it, Governor Edgar. It's everybody's responsibility all the time to recognize that if you're not paying for your bills, you're increasing the cost of government service. Although the state of Illinois has had a remarkable ability to borrow, it doesn't mean that it comes cost-free. It means that it has significant implications and significant costs. This, we were talking a little bit beforehand. Just to frame, without getting into too much detail, we are not in a great place in Illinois financially and in the city of Chicago. The new mayor is going to face a very significant financial challenge, not because Mayor Emanuel didn't try to address the pension issue. He raised property taxes, he raised water fees, he raised the 911 fees, but it wasn't enough to basically avoid what the next mayor faces, which is within about 3 years, Mayor Lightfoot and her team face $1 billion in new revenue needed for the local pension funds. The state of Illinois can't afford to wait to stop running up the unpaid bills. It can't afford to risk pushing its already creaky financial condition out 7 more years and believe that the rating agencies and other contingent challenges are not going to occur. We haven't completed our analysis of Governor Pritzker's budget. We see a lot of positives in his team and what they're willing to talk about. But the people that we're really counting on next are the governor and the General Assembly to really break from the let's wait to the end of session and put our capital plan and put our new forms of legalization of marijuana and gambling and whatever we're going to do in terms of priorities for capital. If we wait until the end and put that all together, we have great reservations. Before the citizens get to know what they're buying, how big their gasoline tax is going to go up, or what other sources, we will have missed an opportunity to rebuild the confidence to the citizens that the state is moving in a different direction.
Jason?
So I would probably peg the state of Illinois' budget somewhere between precarious and a slow motion train wreck. I've been covering the city and state finances now for about 8 years, and the storyline with the state hasn't changed. The 2 most salient themes are putting off tough decisions with magical thinking and operating in a perpetual state of crisis. I'll give you 2 examples. In 2011, I wrote a story about how the General Assembly's constant tinkering with the pension code was contributing to the looming pension crisis. I documented 700 changes to pension laws between 2003 and 2011, something a leading national expert called extraordinary, if not unprecedented. Many of the changes were aimed at either pushing off contributions or expanding benefits to state employees without the funding there to pay for it. When I confronted leadership, they pushed back by pointing to one of their more recent changes at the time, something called the Tier 2, which lowered benefits for new state employees hired after January 1st, 2011. They said the plan would lower contributions for the state to the pension funds and would cut the unfunded liabilities in half. Well, since then, pension contributions have doubled to more than $8 billion. The unfunded pension liabilities have grown 60%, from $85 billion to $133 billion. In addition to exacerbating the intergenerational inequities that have become a hallmark of our state, the plan failed to really move the needle because it was based on some dubious assumptions and avoided the tough, bold action that is going to be necessary to deal with these problems like pensions. This year, I've been writing about the Video Gaming Act for ProPublica, Illinois. Outside of the lottery, it was the largest gambling expansion in state history. Yet lawmakers passed this law in 48 hours. During the depth of the financial crisis, they wanted a capital plan but didn't want to pass the motor fuel tax to pay for it. So they pushed through video gambling with no hearings on the legislation. They never bothered to do a study of the social impact of video gambling on our state. And they relied on rosy revenue projections that never materialized. Yet, within months of passing the legislation, they started borrowing, and they kept on borrowing. Today, Illinois has more places to place a bet than Nevada. Yet the state has no idea how many people are suffering from gambling addiction because it's one of the few states that's never bothered to study the problem. In fact, we spend less today on gambling addiction than we did before we installed 30,000 video gambling machines all across the state. The regulatory agency is woefully underfunded, and this is all basically because the legislator cut a bad deal. We have some of the lowest taxes on video gambling in the country. To me, there's a clear pattern. First, a crisis, then a rush to pass laws with little scrutiny, and then and failure, and then you repeat it. And in the process, our state has pretty much become a laughingstock. The only people who have benefited from this are investors in search of yield. That's why I have to say I winced a little bit when I watched Governor Pritzker's budget address because he was conjuring Henry Horner and the Great Depression. You know, we're in the midst of one of the longest economic expansions in U.S. history, but we're being told there's a crisis, and so we have to rush to legalize marijuana, expand gambling, and push off pension payments so that we can build a bridge to the promised land of a graduated income tax, which I think we absolutely need. The question is whether that bridge will be built, as Laurence said, and what costs are going to be associated with building that bridge, because when you legalize sin, taxes, and whatnot, there are costs associated with that. And it just sounds a lot like the same old story, a vicious cycle, and it breeds cynicism and makes it very difficult to handle these problems.
Thanks, everyone, for your cheery overviews of the state. I'm really excited. I just want to let you know that I do have some questions already from people who have already submitted them, and if you have a question, feel free to send that up to me. We got one already. I wanted to kind of follow up with what Jason was talking about. One of my questions is about legalizing marijuana and also expanded gambling, which Governor Pritzker does want to have that. And he's describing it as a way to kind of get revenue in a quick fashion, but as Jason described, it is a complicated process. Is there a fear that these two might be kind of swept in quickly? And if you've seen revenue estimates on these, you believe they're enough to make a difference to help the state? Both legalizing marijuana and expanded gambling. And I've been told to be snappy, so we're going to do faster answers this time. Yeah.
So they're estimating about $300 million from the two combined, yes. Right? So does that solve our problems? Let me think about it. No. And and when I look at fiscal solutions, I always get nervous when they are new or novel or creative thinking. That's really not how you fix your fiscal system. The hard work is fixing your tax policy. It's got to work in a modern economy. That means you got to look at your big economic taxes. We really only have two at the state level, the income and sales. The Pritzker administration, I think, and we're very supportive of how they've weighed in on what to do with the income tax. As everyone here on the panel has noted, that's more than a year away from actually bearing fruit, more like 18, 24 months if it happens. So how do you get through the interim period from a revenue standpoint? Well, there are 45 states in America that have a sales tax. Of those 45, we tax less of the modern economy than any other one. If we taxed the same services, consumer services, as neighboring Iowa and Wisconsin, that would generate $2 billion in new revenue for the state of Illinois, and interestingly, over $300 million for the city of Chicago, and it wouldn't make us Taxachusetts. It would make us like these other states that actually recognize services are the largest and fastest growing segment of the economy. You just can't leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy out of your tax base and expect you'll have revenue to balance your budget. So on these creative revenues that the Pritzker administration put on the table, I give them, you know, a decent grade for saying, look, we're going to spend more money, and if you add everything together, because they had some changes to federal law and decoupling and video gaming and blah, blah, blah. If you looked at the list, it's about $840 to $843 million in new revenue for the general fund to sort of get some additional spending covered with new revenue. So at least they were saying if we're going to spend more, we want to raise the revenue to cover it. That's responsible. That's new. That's not what's been done in the past. So give them credit for that. But it's not the game changers. It's not the changes to the structural problems. And, you know, Jason, I agree with a lot of what you said, except for the crisis part, because they've had this structural deficit since at least the 70s. It can't be a crisis if it's been going on since the 70s. So since the 70s, their revenue growth, after you adjust for inflation and population change, hasn't been enough to maintain the same level of services from one year into the next. That structural imbalance has grown over time, and it has encouraged the very irresponsible fiscal practice we've all noted of borrowing against what's owed to the pension to hide the structural deficit and fund current services. So literally the pensions have propped up current services for generations. We got to get off of that. We got to create a way to pay our pension debt, and there are ways to do it that are rational over time while raising adequate revenue to fund current services. And that's the hard task, because taxes aren't popular to deal with. You know, tax is one of 2 3-letter words ending in X that gets people very excited in America. Leave you to guess which one's the other one. But it's always hard to change tax policy. But if you don't get your taxes right, and you get these structural deficits, and 9 out of $10 of what you're spending at the state level is education, health, social services, and public safety. As a politician, you don't want to just cut those things to the bone, although we pretty much have in Illinois. You don't want to raise taxes, so you do irresponsible things like borrow against the pensions to plug this gap. So we need good tax revenue that could support current expenditures to meet demographically driven needs. And then we need to rationally re-amortize our pension debt so that we could actually have a payment we could cover that grows the solvency of the systems and makes them healthy over time.
Laurence?
There's a lot of concern about those incomes. And just a couple of things. And Ralph focused a lot on whether you can figure out a way to pay for these pensions or not. The short answer is we haven't figured out a way. And the proposal by the governor doesn't pay for the pensions. We never borrowed against the pensions, Ralph. We just didn't fund them, right? And so we don't want to leave the people, because you go to enough meetings and I go to meetings and people say, where's that money that they took out of my pension? Well, the truth of the matter is we didn't put the money in. We spent the money that was available on other things, so the money's not there.
So the net effect was borrowing,
right?
Though,
when we need the money,
Ralph, what they did was they underfunded the pensions intentionally, wrote an IOU to the pension systems, there's your debt, and took the money that should have gone to fund normal costs to plug the cost of services.
They should have
That's
funded
borrowing
the whole
to fund
thing, not
services.
just the normal costs.
I agree they should have funded the whole thing,
fund
but
their
they
pension.
didn't.
And when you have a proposal like you often do to spend lots of money and you still can't fund the pensions, that's what your problem is, the pensions, and having a comprehensive solution. A big concern is what's going to happen to those pensions when you basically push out the funding. We are not at a place where any reasonable state would say that those pensions are secure. We have the promise that the state is going to honor or we have the constitutional responsibility that says we can't change them, the Civic Federation believes we have to address. The reason why we need a graduated income tax is because we can't afford our pensions. So we should be addressing both of those things at the same time. They were both put in 1970 in the Constitution. We went from basically a treating pensions as a gratuity to now that we have a security responsibility to them. That's the same time then we put in the flat tax. The citizens of Illinois are going to be looking not just for what the General Assembly tells them that's going to happen when they get a graduated income tax. They're going to be watching the General Assembly and the governor as to what happens leading up to the graduated income tax vote, if they should put it on the ballot for 2020. In terms of the revenue forecasted for sports betting, that remains to be seen. Every time it's projected by the governor and his team of about $212 million. The governor did a very good thing in his budget address when he said he wants to add sports gambling and not turn it into a grab bag of all the different tax structures that usually follow gambling.
Okay, we're going to do a quick rebuttal from Ralph, who really wants to say
And
something,
the final
then we're going to go to
thing is on
Jason.
the recreational
We're going to do it in
cannabis.
10 seconds. Go ahead.
The $170 million that the state hopes to get this year and the money from gambling is based on selling licenses in advance of this having a structure for how they're going to occur. It is not likely to be that level of recurring revenue. So it has the potential to be a lot more expected than actually comes in.
So as far as solving the pension problem, you know, my organization has the only viable plan out there. And if you don't believe that, actually read the Supreme Court opinion rulings SB 1 unconstitutional, where they cited my organization's work not once but twice as the rational way to solve the problem. And so we re-amortized the pension debt in a way that levels out the payments, gets us about 72% funded by the year 2045, saves taxpayers $67 billion, issues a few pension obligation bonds up front to put more money in early. It saves $67 billion. And the POB issuance doesn't create any new debt. We owe the money to the pension systems at 6.75 to 7.5%. We could sell a taxable bond at the state level, where they have sold in the last years, between 3.8 and 5.5, so we will save a couple of 100 to 200 basis points right away for taxpayers up front, create an asset in the system that'll bear a return over time, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very rational approach. But our approach focuses on paying the debt, and this is where we're very much different from you, Laurence, because the debt is the driving problem. If you look at the normal cost of funding benefits, it is low and getting lower over time. If you look at how it's made up and in what the different component parts are of the payment. What is skyrocketing and what is backloaded is the debt plan passed in 1995 as the pension ramp, as this backloaded repayment plan. We take that backloaded plan, which was never affordable or attainable, and we flatten it out. And if you don't flatten it out, and this is our difference with the Pritzker administration, they lower the ramp, which is okay, we appreciate that. You do have to lower the slope. We want to flatten it out completely and make it something that taxpayers could afford and that gets the pension systems healthy. So we do have a rational plan for that. We focus on the debt because it's not the pension benefit that created the problem. And to amend the Constitution to allow the pension benefit guarantee to go away won't help us in this fiscal crisis anyway, because you cannot ex post facto, that is retroactively, take away a constitutionally guaranteed right. So the only thing you get from a constitutional amendment on the benefits is you impact new workers hired after the change in the constitutional law, which means we still have to find a way to pay this debt, which means we need a rational amortization schedule for paying this debt, even if you got that change to the Constitution. And by the way, anything you could get out of that change.
Was this going to be the short part?
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, you threw a bunch of stuff out there about what we do and don't do, so I thought I'd clarify what we do with our words rather than yours. What you could do with a pension amendment, you could do with legislation. So there's no need for a pension amendment.
Okay, we clearly have differing opinions here. We're going to go on to Jason to talk about legalized gambling and expansion of casinos. And I'm sorry, marijuana, legalizing marijuana and expansion of gambling.
So yeah, to bring it back to that, I just, you know, having spent the last year digging deeply into video gambling, both of these things raise a lot of red flags for me. The biggest one I think everyone should consider is that it's not free. So there's this idea like, oh, we're going to legalize marijuana and all this money is going to come through and it's not going to cost us anything. That's not true. It costs actually real money. And then there's a lot of social costs that no one ever wants to look at. So, you know, you can go ahead and say we're going to collect, which is exactly what they're doing. We're going to collect it on the front end with the licensing fees. And we're going to get this windfall for a year. But you can't start issuing licensing fees until you have regulations written. And regulations take sometimes a while to write. There's a lot of interests that are involved. And there's going to be, you know, the other thing that's totally missing from both of these things, and these guys got screwed with the video gambling, are the local governments. Local governments got 5% from video gambling. They have their own myriad financial problems. They got pension funds that are also totally underfunded. They got all kinds of other issues. Here we have this massive revenue stream, and all the money is going to pay down debt for a capital program that's pretty much over now. So, you know, so these one-offs that somehow we think are going to be the magic bullet, I think we should be very skeptical. And I can tell you who's very skeptical are the credit rating agencies. So if we want to borrow to get out of other issues, they're all, I've read all the reports, they're out there to read. They're not buying this plan per se. And they're very skeptical about the revenues that sports gambling and marijuana can bring in. So then if you don't build the bridge, right, and you're here in 2020 and you're going out to the taxpayers and saying, hey, we want to increase your, you know, well, not everyone's, I guess some people will get a break. We want a graduated income tax. And oh, by the way, the wealthiest citizens, we're going to tax all your income at the highest level. I'm sure they're not going to be too thrilled about that. So they're already, you know, coming up with groups that are going to fight the income tax. So, you know, I'm really concerned if we don't follow through with what we say we're going to do, if we don't build this bridge, when we get to trying to push this income tax, or, excuse me, graduated income tax, there's going to be this issue, and then what? If we get another downgrade, we're going to be in junk status. Our borrowing costs are going to go even higher than they already are. We have a Illinois penalty that we already pay, and now now we got real problems. We've lost population the last 5 years in a row. We're one of the only states that have done this. Our job growth is lower than the rest of the country. It seems like we need to do a lot of things very quickly.
I have a stack of questions from people here, so I'm going to get to that. I have one from Rod Height, who's a member. He is with, hopefully I'm saying this right, Arius and Information Solutions. Rod here somewhere? Somewhere. Hi, Rod. The question is, what are the obstacles and potential benefits of a casino in Chicago proper? Who wants to tackle that?
The obstacle is that you would need the state of Illinois to authorize a casino. Mayor Emanuel has been supportive recently, I believe, of a casino. He wants the city of Chicago to own the casino. That raises questions in our mind at the Civic Federation, how good the city of Chicago would be in the hospitality industry, competing with the likes. So I think there are some concerns. Gambling is an inherently an unreliable way to fund your government. As Jason has detailed, the video poker is the front and center issue as to why that easy answer of taxing someone else, whether it's the richest people or whether it's the people that are visiting here, if it relies on gaming especially, we have a great appetite for it in Illinois, but we have seen that it has not been the panacea. The lottery didn't solve education funding. Casinos didn't solve all the local towns around the state of Illinois that have them. And it's not the answer for the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago faces almost parallel challenges as the state of Illinois, driven largely by its high debt and its unfunded pension liabilities. The gift from the Illinois General Assembly and previous administrations were basically requirements on underfunding the pension and pension holidays. The one thing that we have never been able to figure out how to fund is the 3% compounded automatic increase that we put into the pension system for Illinois. There's never been a time when the state fully funded that. That is the challenge that we see going forward for the state of Illinois. That would be the parallel answer, addressing that 3% compounded automatic increase.
Okay, he snuck in some pension stuff there, but Jason, what are your thoughts on a Chicago casino, and if there's any potential benefits there, if you've talked about some of the challenges?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of how much revenue is a casino going to actually bring into the city. Certainly there's a huge potential for impacting the video gambling. If you look at a map, so at ProPublica, we did a map of every gambling location, video gambling location, and we have bars to show the revenue that is coming in from those locations. If you look around the city of Chicago, which is the only city that doesn't have video gambling, it's like a wall of revenue. It's like there's so much. I mean, go outside the boundaries of Chicago. These video gambling machines are everywhere. If you build a casino in Chicago, in all likelihood, I would think some of that revenue is going to fall off pretty steadily. So now you're talking about taking money from the state. And this is the other problem with gambling. There's only so many gambling dollars. They cannibalize each other. So for example, what we found is when they legalized video gambling, as it grew, casino revenue tanked, started falling. Well, casino revenue's taxed at a progressive rate that goes up to 50%. Video gambling's taxed at a flat rate of 35%, once again, one of the lowest in the country. And so we have a lot more gambling going on in the state, but our cut of the proceeds has actually fallen. The percentage amount we get from that, all that gambling has fallen because we've had one form of gambling that was a flat tax cannibalize a progressive tax. I think Laurence brings up a really good point in terms of regulating a Chicago casino. I think that's going to be a huge challenge to have a separate entity that's going to oversee that casino, but that's outside of the other entity that we have overseeing the 10 casinos we already have. So again, I think it's a lot better than legalizing video gambling in the city of Chicago, which is what I fear they'll do once they figure out they can't get a casino because the downstate people won't do it. But again, I don't think it's something we should bank on.
Yeah, and gaming revenue over time just doesn't grow with the economy, so it contributes to structural deficits over time. It's not a way for long-term balancing your budget. It's a way to short-term infuse some money in, and then the money growth sort of flattens out over time, creating a structural imbalance problem, number one. Number two, Jason, you talked about this earlier. There are costs associated with gaming, right, and gambling addiction and all that other stuff, and crime and all those things. And so it's not just a pure, free, neutral revenue source. And a number of years ago when gambling again was on the ticket for something to do to raise money for education at the time, slots for tots, I guess, we called in an economist from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William Thompson. He writes country western songs under Billy Gamble, by the way. He's a big proponent of the gaming industry. And he said, the gaming industry is great for Nevada. It's terrible for Illinois. And it's terrible for Illinois from an economic standpoint because well over 90% of your gaming is in-state. So it's residents gambling at your own facilities. And that truly is substitute purchasing. And if you think about incomes are flat or declining after inflation for 90% of the country since 1979. What are they substituting their purchasing patterns for? It's consumer spending. So instead of buying goods and products and services in the Illinois economy, they're gambling at these facilities that are largely owned by out-of-state entities, et cetera, et cetera. Well, certainly the profits don't all stay here. So the way that works economically is really instead of creating long-term economic growth, it probably costs your private sector economy job loss over the long term as it flattens out or constrains consumer spending, and consumer spending is 68% of all economic activity. So it's really not a win-win any way you look at it. It's one of those short-term get through a budget cycle or two or three with some new money. If you do the gaming, do it. I have all the same regulatory issues that both Laurence and Jason raised, but from a long-term economic standpoint and a long-term fiscal standpoint, it's not a winner.
And can I just say that there are human lives at stake here. We know from the research that 2% of the population is going to have a gambling addiction problem, and that's something the American Psychiatric Association now has made an actual illness, even though some people still don't believe it's there. The dopamines go off. It's very similar to drugs and alcohol. It's also a regressive tax. So what you're doing is you're hitting the pocketbooks of the most vulnerable people in the state. And at the same time, you're going to pass a graduated income tax that taxes the highest people at the state, at the top bracket for all of their income rather than some kind of marginal setup. So, those things are really easy to forget, and I don't think we should forget them as we, move down this road.
People laugh about this, but do you think that the Thompson Center location could be a site of a Chicago casino? Some people would like this.
I think it would do well as an aquarium as well, but my opinion doesn't matter since I don't have the $300 to $400 million that the state has thought that it could use. I think the Thompson Center, and even though Governor Pritzker recently signed the legislation to allow for the sale, is going to be problematic. The real estate market for that location, we're told by real estate experts, is not as strong. It's not the same as basically being on the river or being a more desirable site. And we're all aware of the fact that the L and other things run underneath it. It's a very expensive proposition. We also need a plan for what the state of Illinois would do with the state workers that are in that building now, where they would operate. So I don't think it's likely to be a casino. And the final reason why I don't know a lot about gambling, but I do know this: they don't have a lot of windows in a casino, and that building is nothing but windows.
I'm going to switch gears unless anyone wants to touch on what you think the Thompson Center should be. People say a water park. We actually have a question. It's back to our graduated income tax struggle here, but it's interesting because it's what one of the dark money groups keeps saying. This is from Charlie Gardner, from Roosevelt M. Life trustee. To what extent should we be worried about rich people leaving Illinois because of the tax rate change?
Yeah, I don't know if you just saw the big report that was put out by the business. What's the name?
BGA.
The BGA. That sort of dispelled that myth. You know, there's never been, we looked at all the peer-reviewed literature, there's never been a peer-reviewed study done in academia or by a governmental entity like the Congressional Budget Office, et cetera, that finds a statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration. So other things matter more. When you look at what matters more to migration, you know, where your family is, where your job is, where the weather's nice. I know that won't resonate in this audience because we live here, but I mean, where the weather's nice apparently appeals to some people. And housing prices. Those are the things that have a statistically meaningful correlation. But literally the theory that if you raise taxes on rich people, they'll run fleeing means, right, if you take it at its face, that tax policy is so important to rich people, it will influence where they move. California increased its top income tax rate in 2012 to over 13.5% on millionaires. And we only have data through 2015, but in each of 2012, 13, 14, and 15, they had net migration in of millionaires. So if the theory is right, that tax policy motivates millionaires to move, apparently they can't wait to be taxed more because they're moving by droves into California. I mean, this is just one of those arguments that's out there that's really not at all supported by the evidence. And, you know, 41 states have an income tax. Of those 41 states, all but 8 of them have a progressive rate structure with higher rates on the top. So it's just not an argument that should be given any credibility.
Laurence?
Stability. That's what attracts people. Predictability. Where Illinois' proposed graduated income tax, or the debate on a graduated income tax, is in danger is when we don't know what the state is going to do next. I think Governor Pritzker should be applauded. We commended him for coming out with his rates and his income levels. That was a great first step into the discussion. But people, you don't have to rely on studies or analysis. Just talk to your friends and your neighbors. They're talking about this constant financial crisis of the state. And if we have to wait 2.5 to 3 years and then basically, well, in 2.5 years or in 2020, in November, when the state votes on a graduated income tax, if people don't see the state already stabilized, that the city of Chicago is stabilized, that we're not in a continued financial crisis, then if they don't see that, if they don't see that stability, they may not take the General Assembly and the governor's word that it's going to all work out fine and that they should go ahead and tax it. If there isn't security as to that the highest income rates are not going to be basically continue to be jacked up while the lower rates are left alone, or at least the middle rates are, there needs to be some assurance that a graduated income tax actually fixes the problem. If all it does is provide more revenue and the problem continues to fester, the state is structurally unbalanced, the pension obligations remain at 25% of the state's operating budget, or the city of Chicago can't make its $1 billion new pension contribution, then I think we should all be worried, because people will be leaving, people will not stay. We need to get to the part which business people understand, financially sophisticated people understand. We are in a crisis. We need to do some things differently. We need to restructure our government. There is no justification for having 600 pension funds in Illinois when you look across the border to Wisconsin that has 2 for its police and fire pension fund. People know that. People know something's the matter. We are at a turning point. Will it be the graduated income tax that fixes everything? Not unto itself. Will the graduated income tax basically be the cause why some people leave? Possibly. But more importantly is the thing we have to fix is you have to make sure that you stabilize not just the state. And what's different now than the last time we had a new mayor in Chicago is Chicago's financial condition. In spite of Mayor Emanuel's hard work, going to Springfield so many times to get pension funding and pension reform for the police and fire, for the municipal and for the laborers. What's different now is we're already junk. We're junk bond. That's the way the rating agencies look at the city of Chicago. The city of Chicago and the state of Illinois are handcuffed together in terms of their financial future. And if we don't have a comprehensive plan to address it that includes pension reform, then it's unlikely we're going to hang on to all the people we have now.
Yeah, I think the bigger issue is the fight to pass a graduated income tax, which I think we absolutely need. You know, just as Laurence said, if there's no movement forward, I think it's going to be a hard sell. You know, if you read the, you know, again, some of the credit rating agency reports, you know, they point out that even if we pass a graduated income tax as it's structured now, it's only $200 million a year to the pensions. So it's not like it's going to be it's not going to be a panacea to solve all of our problems. And the thing that I get concerned about are people that are opposed to it are going to use stuff like that as a cudgel to beat it back, and we won't be able to put in place something that I think we desperately need.
A quick follow-up that I just got. Are people leaving because of the estate tax?
No.
I think, and I've thought a lot about the estate tax, and I've talked with this governor and his team and the previous governor and his team. The problem with the estate tax is Illinois has one of the higher estate tax rates, and we don't collect very much. And it's my sense that one of the problems is people, not when they're deceased, right, think about moving, they think about moving 20 or 30 years before that. So if you're pretty wealthy, right, or if you're basically secure and you meet with your financial planner, right, they're going to tell you that you could stay in Illinois and leave X amount of money to your children, or you could go someplace else without an estate tax. And it's not just the places without income tax. California has a lower estate tax. And it's there, so people are making decisions. The people we don't want to leave the state, the wealthiest people, are making decisions based on their own enlightened interests. So yeah, the estate tax has an impact.
Well, if you look at the demographics, though, the people that are leaving are lower income and middle income minorities. They're going to Atlanta, they're going south, and they're going because there's more job opportunities there. We have, you know, a lot of things going on in the city of Chicago, but a lot of it is, excuse me, my annoying watch. You know, is really for wealthier people. You know, it's great when Google comes, you know, maybe Amazon will show up at some point. Those are high-end jobs. So what kind of, you know, steady, you know, middle-income jobs do we have there? Our manufacturing base is eroding. I mean, one of the really bright spots in Illinois is we have such a diverse economy. We have agriculture, we have manufacturing, tech industries growing. And so what are we doing to really focus on keeping the middle class here? So I guess I'm not too concerned about rich people, what rich people want to do down the road. I don't want them to go, per se. But I think
look at the estate tax.
Yeah, okay. But I mean, look at the cities, look at some of the neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. They've cratered out. We've had to close schools because there's no opportunities here for those people. They're leaving, and we don't want them to leave. It makes our city less diverse. just a more of a
Yeah,
less
I
of
don't
a fun
disagree
place
with
to
you,
be.
right? I mean, I think it's a very, if there is one thing that we should all be aware of, is the crisis in Chicago and the state of Illinois on population loss. We don't have the demographic information. We've looked for it at the Civic Federation for where those people went or what their motivations were in terms of what they went. We certainly look at Northeast Indiana and the south side of Chicago and the loss of manufacturing and industry. So it's reasonable to presume that that's where they went. But we need a plan, and the new mayor needs a plan to basically not just stabilize the people that are here, but to go back to where we were actually growing population. A big part of the 90s was the immigration covered or provided a inflow. If you look at if you look at the people around the table, most of you aren't going to have very many more children, and so that basically the population is stable in terms of our fertility rates in Chicago, and so the challenge is to make sure that we're getting new people here to support our existing infrastructure.
We're going to go quickly to Ralph.
Yeah,
and then
just a couple of things, because I think we're missing the point on why middle-income families and lower middle-income families are leaving Illinois. And a lot of it has to do with the state's fiscal problems and the city of Chicago's fiscal problems and their lack of investment in core things like education. I'll talk about higher ed for 10 seconds. So we are, in the 2019 budget for the state of Illinois, we are going to appropriate less in nominal dollars to higher education than we did in the year 2000. When you adjust for inflation, it's a 52% cut. So has that had a consequence? And the answer is yeah. So we only have data through 2017, but from 2000 to 2017, tuition at public universities and community colleges in Illinois has risen by 136% in real terms. Nationally, it rose by 83%. We're increasing at 52 percentage points faster than the nation in our tuition costs. By the way, over that same period of time, median income is down by 1.7%. If you're a middle-income family and you want to send your kid to college, you want to take advantage of a good public university, you're going to move to Indiana or Wisconsin or Michigan or whatever and afford school, as opposed to staying in Illinois where you can't afford school. I mean, it's that simple. You look at K-12 education. You know, we passed a great school funding bill a couple of years ago called the evidence-based formula. It ties school funding to what the evidence has shown are the practices that actually enhance student achievement, right? We are $7.3 billion short right now of what the evidence indicates is needed for every school in Illinois to provide those types of educational services where their children could succeed academically. The gap per student, if you looked at it geographically in underfunded communities, for example, in the collar counties, in schools that are underfunded, $2,400 per kid. Statewide average is about $3,000 per kid. Downstate, $3,800. Do you know what it is in CPS? $5,100 per student. By far and away the biggest funding gap in the state. People are leaving Chicago? Yeah, they are, especially low and middle income families. Why are they going to send their kids to a school that is that underfunded from what the research indicates is needed for their kids to have a chance to succeed academically? Parents are smart. I mean, so fixing fiscal problems isn't just about balancing the budget. It's ensuring your state is making adequate investments in these core services that create quality of life and encourage people to stay in your state. And we're not doing that because of our fiscal problems, and that's why we have to deal with our pension ramp the appropriate way, flatten out the payments, raise new revenue, and move forward.
I'm getting the wrap-up sign. I don't know if anyone kept track of the numbers of time we said pension, because it could be like a drinking game, anybody. But thank you to everybody. I think you guys proposed a lot of solutions. I do have the wrap-up sign, right? Or do I have time for one more question? There we go.
One more question, as long as Ralph doesn't go off on
I'm actually interested in this, yes. It's about the census in 2020 and how that might change the way that funds will be distributed throughout the state. And this is from Pam Sandin, an NAACP Southside branch employee. And I thought that was interesting because that might shift some things. We're going to do a quick one. Anybody have an answer?
The census has a big impact. We need to be paying attention to it. It's probably not going to be greatly in our favor from a positive standpoint because we're losing population. But a very similar issue is that the General Assembly considers the capital plan is support for public transit. And our if public transit is not adequately funded in the whatever comes out of Springfield in the capital plan, it will have a significant impact on this city in a negative way.
I'll just agree.
Wow. All right.
You're not going to get any help from the feds to make it.
True enough.
Our officers.
Jeff Berkowitz, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. We're going to take a bit of an in-depth look at the run for the mayor of Chicago.
The Illinois Channel, keeping you connected to your state, your issues, your home.